Close your eyes and imagine. What if the things in life that cause us the greatest pain, the things that bring us grief, are challenges? Challenges designed to help us grow, to ultimately become what we were always meant to be. We feel like we've been buried, but what if, like a seed, we've been planted? And having been planted, we grow to become a mighty tree. Now, open your eyes. Open your eyes to this way of viewing life. Come with me as we explore your true, infinite, eternal nature. This is Grief to Growth, and I am your host, Brian Smith. Hey there, and welcome to Grief to Growth. I'm your host, Brian Smith, and whether this is your first time joining me or you're a longtime listener, I'm so glad you're here. On this podcast, we explore life's deepest questions, who we are, why we're here, and what happens when we leave this world behind. It's a journey through grief, through growth, and ultimately through transformation. Today, I have the honor of speaking with someone whose work blends science, spirit, and storytelling. His name is Daniel Drasin, and Daniel is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and a seasoned media producer whose career spans over 6 decades. But over the last 30 years, he's taken a deep dive into something far less conventional, but profoundly compelling, and that's afterlife communication. So through his acclaimed documentaries Calling Earth and Scole, the Afterlife Experiment, Daniel has explored both traditional and high-tech methods of connecting with the other side. In his latest project, a thought-provoking book titled A New Science of the Afterlife, Daniel invites us to challenge assumptions, to rethink science, and reimagine what it means to be conscious beings in a larger interconnected reality. So during our conversation today, we're going to unpack what led Daniel from filmmaking to afterlife research, how he separates true skepticism from dismissive debunking, and why he believes our very language shapes what we're able to understand about consciousness, about life, and beyond. We'll also touch on a deeply personal question, how he feels about his own mortality after decades of studying what might lie beyond it. So you're not going to want to miss this one, especially if you've ever wondered about whether our connections truly end when someone dies or if they simply change form. And after you've listened, I invite you to keep the conversation going by going to our community at grieftogrowth.com/community. There you can connect with me and with other listeners who are walking this path of discovery and of healing. And with that, I'd like to welcome Daniel to Grief to Growth.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you for the invitation, and look forward to a wonderful discussion with you.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. I was telling you before we started recording, I have watched Calling Earth. I don't know how many times. I put it on my list of recommended resources. It's a great film. I also watched the Scole experiment. I think it's a great film also. So I want to thank you first of all for putting that out into the world. I'm really curious. I know you've had a long career in filmmaking. What led you to start doing exploration of the afterlife?
Well, it was a natural extension of interests and inklings that I've had all of my life. I've had a number of what you might call paranormal experiences throughout my life, starting in my childhood, actually, when I had a number of precognitive dreams. And I didn't understand how that worked, but it was enough to clue me into the fact that in the theater of life, stuff goes on backstage.
I like that. Yeah.
That we don't have the whole picture. And anyway, following that, I became extremely interested in the UFO question and studied that for years, had a number of my own sightings and experiences. And that reinforced my sense that our world and the preoccupations of our world and the language that we use, no matter what language we use, tends to limit our sense of reality. And I think there's a lot to recommend that in terms of practical functioning in the world. But I think it also can mislead us when it comes to the larger questions of life and death, of course. And your title, Grief to Growth, is meaningful to me because however sophisticated and understanding we may be about the greater reality and the afterlife, on the human level, loss is still loss. And we have to deal with that on the human level. So I think when we look comprehensively at these questions writ large, that both our humanity and the non-physical or spiritual side of our nature have to be seen in a holistic way. Now, with that said, of course, our culture places much more emphasis on the purely physical and on the materialistic in both senses of the word, both technically and culturally.
Yeah.
And I think that the cultural emphasis on materialism, it of course it reflects our beliefs about reality, about what's important. And it's something that we're dealing with, politically and in the world at large right now. These are big questions. So, but I think understanding the other side of life, the part of us that lives in consciousness at all times. We're there right now. In some of my presentations, my live presentations, I've said to the audience, there's nothing to worry about. We're already dead.
I love that. Yeah.
And you see the jaws drop and so on. And then people start to think about it and realize that if they came to my presentation in the first place, they must have some sense of what that means.
Mm-hmm.
That we're just looking through these eyes. But who's the we? And if the we that's looking through these eyes is still the we after the eyes go away, then, as some people say, there is no death.
Mm-hmm.
Simply a shift of perspective or a changing of perceived form, however you want to look at it. So, on the one hand, here we are in our physical bodies, in our society, in our culture, working from 9 to 5 or whatever we do, raising families. And that's one side of life, but that's only half. It's only one side. And the other half, I think, is coming into the spotlight now for a number of reasons. I think one reason is that we are collectively sensing the sort of the emptiness of a materialistically oriented culture. It doesn't really go anywhere. And we see its consequences, globally in the news. I don't have to go into too much detail there. I mean, you look at the Middle East, which we call the Holy Land, and a lot of what's going on there is, in my opinion, far from holy.
Yeah, yeah.
So, a lot of what doesn't work in our cultures, in our society, in our outlook of life, is being projected out there for us to see. And I think some of us who are really interested in pushing through that or getting through that, opening up that curtain and going backstage, as it were, and seeing more of how it all works.
Mm-hmm.
We're starting to do that. In my own, I would say that to answer the question of when I really started to focus on the question of the afterlife, it was around 1990 or so. And it was partly kickstarted by meeting my friend Mark Macy, who had been doing a lot of research and practice in instrumental transcommunication,
Mm-hmm.
Communication with the other side through modern electronics. And that sort of turned my head around a little bit because it spoke to me because I sort of tend to see myself as at the interface between the material and the spiritual. And, the material is what our society recognizes and respects, particularly technology, which works for us. It's amazing that you and I can be here halfway across the country from each other,
Yeah,
and have this wonderful conversation. And we sort of take it for granted. The latest generation just, was born into this environment. It's natural to us now.
right.
I take my daily walk along this creek you can see in the background, and there's a wonderful path where parents will be strolling with their kids, and bicyclists will come by, and lots of dogs. It's a wonderful environment, and everyone's on their phone.
Yeah.
And it's to me it's disturbing and also fascinating. We're symbiotic with our smartphones. Can you imagine leaving your home and realizing you forgot your phone behind?
Yeah, it's a weird feeling, right? You feel naked.
Exactly, naked and powerless. So, we've kind of maybe we haven't reached the pinnacle because AI hasn't matured yet, but we're so interwoven with the technical side of our society and our culture, that I think that this opening up of a greater awareness is it's almost like we're being squeezed into it by the excuse me by the coldness and the soullessness of this increasingly artificial environment. So does that make sense to you?
It does. Yeah, it makes 100% sense to me. And I love the way you use both forms of the word materialist, because when we say materialist society, it can mean either or both. And there is, and right before we got on, I was watching your short film, Science versus Skepticism. And I think that's really interesting in our society because people will say that they're skeptics when they're really, the term you use is debunkers. And I would call they are just people who are cynics who say this isn't possible. So, like they wouldn't even explore the areas that we're talking about because they have this materialistic mindset.
Right, and in doing so, they've basically betrayed the science that they purport to be defending.
Exactly.
I mean, if you presuppose that something doesn't exist without actually inquiring into it, why practice any science at all?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's not a scientific approach to say that something is not possible. And we can point out, like, if a couple hundred years ago we were talking to someone and said it's possible to speak to someone from Cincinnati in San Francisco and see their face and hear their voice instantaneously, you would say no, that's impossible. That could not possibly be done.
They might have locked you up,
Yeah, yeah.
as some people still do to those who report near-death experiences.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, that still happens. Um, I know one woman from the San Francisco Bay Area who had had a profound near-death experience. She reported it at the local IANS meeting a few years ago. It was an amazing story. And she said that she had to separate from her family
Mm.
because according to their religion, this was the work of the devil or whatever it was. And they almost wanted to have her locked up.
Yeah, and that's another really good point. It's interesting how sometimes it'll be religion who's supposedly spiritual who will say that this is impossible, and the other times it's the exact opposite, right? It's the materialists that say it's impossible. Um,
I think it's the difference between ideology and science.
exactly.
Ideology requires no procedure, no practice,
Right.
because you already know everything you need to know, right? Done.
Yeah.
Science is, in its essence, the exact opposite. To me, science is organized curiosity.
Mm.
And when something shows up that doesn't fit our pictures, we can say we're not interested. That's fine.
Right.
But if we are interested, the Science 101 compels us to start asking questions. Is this a hallucination? Is it something that we don't understand yet? Let's find out.
Yeah.
Not be afraid of it. And I think even more importantly, let's not be afraid of our peers.
Yeah.
That I think is probably the greatest challenge. A few years ago, I met some women who were nurses in a children's cancer ward. And I had at that time proposed doing a little documentary about them. It didn't get made, but I learned a few things about the sociology of sociology of the medical profession.
Hmm.
Um, the film was going to be called "Don't Tell the Doctor," because these women had incredible experiences working with these dying children,
Yeah.
and they could speak about it among themselves. But the doctors, and that
Yeah.
was for the doctor's own protection too. Um, I don't know if you're familiar with the Pam Reynolds case. She was a country singer in Atlanta, and she had an aneurysm in the brain, and it was inoperable at first. But she discovered that a doctor in Atlanta, excuse me, in Phoenix, had developed a procedure they could safely do surgery on the aneurysm. And this procedure was called a standstill operation, because what they do is they drain all the fluids out of the body, all the blood. They cool the body down to like 55 degrees. So it's essentially dead. It's totally flatlined in all respects. At that point, they can safely operate on the brain. So as Pam was in the recovery room, she started describing the operation. And she was a musician, and with perfect pitch. So she said, and the bone saw made a C-sharp tone. And she went on and on about this.
Yeah.
So the case became rather well known at the time. And my co-producer Tim and I went and actually interviewed her at her home. And you know, she was the genuine article. She was conscious during this operation, spoke in detail about it. There are many accounts of this sort of thing where the person on the operating table will tell you what conversations were going on in the hallway outside the operating room,
Right.
and where people were sitting and what they were talking about. So when you really look into it, you can't explain this away. And you know, some scientists are still trying to do that, but the evidence is out there, and if you look into it, it's a slam dunk.
I completely agree with you. I was just speaking with someone the other day, and I said, there are different levels of proof, and I like to use the courtroom analogy, right? In a criminal case, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, and I believe that after the afterlife has been proven beyond any reasonable doubt, when you look for the simplest explanation, which is what Occam's razor tells us we should go with, and you'll find some of these quote skeptics who will start just to really make up all kinds of crazy stuff to explain things, anything other than what's staring you in the face. So I'd like to talk to people who are not familiar with the afterlife experiments about what are calling Earth. I mean, calling Earth. What is that? What are they going to find in that film?
Okay, well, just to go back a little into history, back in the 1950s, when tape recorders became commercially available to anyone, people bought these machines and they recorded their kids' voices and their preachers' Sunday preaching and their home music and so on. And that was all well and good, except now and then people would hear voices on these tapes that didn't belong there. And in the United States, these voices were generally dismissed as, well, maybe the machine was picking up a radio broadcast or something like that. And it never went any further than that. But in Europe, things were different. A number of experimenters became interested. One was a very prominent filmmaker and actor and artist by the name of Friedrich Jurgensen, Swedish man. And he went out one night to record nocturnal bird sounds for a documentary he was producing. And when he played the tape back, between the nocturnal bird sounds, he heard faint voices discussing nocturnal bird sounds. So he said, well, this is strange. There must be some radio station where they were discussing nocturnal bird sounds. Anyway, shortly thereafter, on one of his tapes, he heard the voice of his deceased mother calling him by his childhood nickname. And at that point, he sort of threw up his hands and said, look, we got to go after this scientifically. What's actually going on here? So he experimented over many years, and he recorded thousands of these voices. He was then joined by a Latvian professor, Konstantin Raudava, who did his own experiments. And by the time he died in 1974, he'd recorded between 60 and 70,000 of these voices. He published a phonograph record with quite a number of these voices where he was actually in dialogue asking questions, and then answers would come back. So that sort of jump-started the practice. It has then been taken on by a lot of ordinary folks around the world who at first used things like cassette recorders, reel-to-reel recorders, cassette recorders, and so on. And now, they're using their smartphones and receiving messages to one degree of clarity or another some are kind of crude, but they shouldn't be happening at all. So even if you can't understand the words, something's going on that's not otherwise explicable.
Right.
And in the best cases, where people practice it regularly and are really tuned into particularly loved ones on the other side, they tend to get a more consistent results. We don't understand how it works from our technical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
We don't understand the conditions that either impede it um, or make it more likely to happen at a given point in time. I have this metaphor of imagine two railroad trains traveling on squiggly tracks like this at different speeds, and there's only one open window in each train, and you got to throw a spitball between the trains at the moment when those windows line up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's obviously just a metaphor, but it's that kind of a situation where the forces involved we don't understand them.
Right.
But the results happen often enough and consistently enough for people who are seriously practicing these things, that the phenomenon can't be denied. There are other possibly more frequent forms of electronic communication or electrical communication, you might say, in the form of lights getting switched on and off.
Mm-hmm.
That's evidently much easier for those on the other side to do than transmitting the complexities of language. It's a simple on-off condition.
Mm-hmm.
But I've experienced it, friends have experienced it. I was at an event a few years ago. It was held at a church that was partly a memorial for someone who had been a lighting expert, by the way. And as soon as the memorial for this man started, the lights in the church started to blink on and off.
Wow.
And then when the memorial was concluded, the lights stayed on. So, and you wonder how often these things happen and they're simply dismissed or forgotten or suppressed.
Yeah.
That's one of my chief concerns is this, again, the sociological aspect where people are afraid to talk about these things.
Mm-hmm.
In my book, I ask, how do we know that our next door neighbors don't have rollicking conversations with their dead uncles every Wednesday at 9 p.m.? We don't, because who would admit to it, right?
That is a really good point because after my daughter passed away and we started having phenomena,
Mhm.
and I would discuss it with my neighbors, and these are people I'd known for 20 plus years. Then suddenly the stories came out. Oh yeah, when my father passed away, then this happened. When my mother has precognitive dreams, I've had this phenomena happen. And so to your point, these are people I'd known for decades and never had that conversation until I brought it up first.
Right. I've had that experience many times. Years ago, when I was really interested, still am, but when I was first really interested in the whole UFO question, I would ask people, have you ever had a sighting or an experience? And they say, oh, no, it's nonsense. And they'd say, oh, wait a minute. There's something that happened when I was 14 years old. And then the whole story comes tumbling out.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when people feel that they're in a safe space, they're much more likely to remember these things in the first place, and then to share them. Um, and it's like any of these other ideological struggles that we have in our world. Um, it's hard for truth to come out. And by the way, I very rarely use the word truth. I'll explain that in a minute. But it's hard for it to come out when you're in an atmosphere of disapproval or judgment.
Mm-hmm.
So what's paranormal? And how do we know?
Right.
You know, um, the more questions I ask, the more I tend to believe that these things are perfectly normal in many people's lives, and that they've just simply dismissed them or forgotten about them, or they have been reluctant to share them.
Yeah.
So
Well, really good question. What's paranormal? And I say it's anything that we can't explain yet. Anything we can't explain yet, we call paranormal. And some of us even goes far enough to say, well, then we're going to dismiss it because I'm a scientist myself. My background is engineering, chemical engineering,
right,
and so when I'm looking at things, I'm like, what's natural? What's supernatural? Well, I've come to the conclusion there's nothing that's supernatural. There's just things that we can't explain yet.
Right. Well, that's like the first law of science. Don't dismiss anything until you've investigated it.
Right.
Don't predefine things. Um, and like when anything, whether it's religion or science or anything else, becomes institutionalized and ossified, that's the sort of thing that's going to happen, especially if there's a profit, if there's profit motive involved or political power involved.
Mm-hmm.
Human beings will tend to do what human beings do all too often. You mentioned your daughter. When did she pass away?
2015.
Oh, how old was she?
She was 15.
Oh, wow. Is that a picture of her behind you there?
Yeah, that's my daughter, Shayna. Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Well, and speaking of, lights coming on and off. Now, when Shayna first passed, we got a lot of signs around the house, lights coming on and off, things like that. Particularly the light in our bedroom. We have a ceiling fan that operates by remote, and the fan would be on, and the light would come on. When we would go upstairs for bed at night. Hasn't happened much recently, but Sunday, as we're recording this last Sunday was Mother's Day, and my wife was hoping to get a sign from Shayna. And as we were going upstairs to go to bed, my wife walks in the bedroom first, and the light was on and the fan was going. And she goes, "That's my sign from Shayna today." So that's my ITC for this week.
Right. And it is a form of ITC. It's one of the most frequent and easiest to pull off, as far as I can tell. Um,
Yeah,
and it's not a highly detailed communication, but just to know that they're still there,
yeah.
and that in and of itself is a lovely thing.
So in Calling Earth, we talked about one form, which is EVP or electronic voice phenomena. There's some other types of ITC that are documented in the film as well. So could you share what some of those are?
Well, sure. Some of them are images seen on television sets and on computers. Um, Klaus Schreiber was a German fellow who had quite a number of deaths in his family over a short period of time, and he was grieving. But he decided he would try electronic voice phenomenon. So he got a cassette recorder and he made contact, and the voices on the other side suggested to him that he try working with video. And at that time, this was in the 1970s, where videotape equipment was just then available to the public, and was fairly primitive technology, but it worked.
Mm-hmm.
And so he started to experiment, didn't get very far, and then he teamed up with an electronic engineer who made some suggestions. And the main one was to set up a video feedback loop. And that is where a camera set up the monitor, and you set up the camera, and the camera is looking at its own feed, its own image on the monitor. And the result is a very kind of often very kind of flowing abstract pattern. And he was told that those on the other side could most easily manipulate this sort of thing into a coherent image. And that's what happened. He received images of deceased family members, and also of noted individuals who had recently passed, a couple of German actresses, a nobleman, so on and so on. And he had no way of editing his tape, so he re-videotaped off the screen, and the results were kind of fuzzy, but quite recognizable. I mean, they weren't awful. And so he had maybe dozens, at least several dozen that I know of these images that are quite outstanding and recognizable.
Mm-hmm.
Other experimenters, there's a couple in the small European country of Luxembourg who were receiving images just on a computer screen. The computer was not connected to any network. It was just standing alone on their desk. And images from the other side would appear, and they would photograph them. Those on the other side claimed that they had constructed a communication station from which these images were sent.
Hmm.
Um, also, text would appear on this computer. And in one instance, they sent this text to my friend Mark Macy in Colorado. Um, and it was a communication from a deceased journalist. He died in 1912, same day that the Titanic sank. And in this communication, he talked about his childhood in England. He got married in Jamaica, moved to Brooklyn, New York, where he worked for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle newspaper. He listed all of the addresses where he lived.
Hmm.
So Mark did a whole bunch of research in the Brooklyn Public Library, in the Library of Congress. He had a detective over in the UK work on this, and he found that all of the details that this man had presented in this communication were 100% accurate.
Wow.
And this was text
Yeah.
come through. So we don't have a useful picture yet of how this is accomplished on the other side. But my sense of it, for what it's worth, is that just as our physical environment is made out of matter, the environment on the other side is made out of consciousness. And we ourselves, particularly in the experience of dreaming, are all aware of how we can, or parts of our psyche can create whole environments.
Mm-hmm.
They're perfectly solid and perfectly physical to us when we're in that experience.
Yeah.
I think that should give us a clue of how our awareness itself is not just a passive receiver, but that we are creating our own impression of reality, even as we are in our physical bodies in our physical environment. Like if you and I were sitting together in the same physical place, I would have no idea how you perceive that.
Right. Right.
You just don't know. And I think that if more people realize that, there'd be less strife in the world.
Yeah, well, I think we're starting to get to some of that. There's a concept now. Well, it's not new, but it's new to me in several years called idealism, which is the idea that the consciousness is the precursor to matter, and that in fact that matter is just another form of consciousness. That there really is no physical as per se. And some of the scientists back in the late early 1900s were saying the same thing that consciousness is fundamental, and we've kind of forgotten that. And I think if we had that idea, and I love when you talked about dreaming, because that's one that really occurs to me all the time. Because I'll become lucid in my dreams,
Mm.
and I'll say I'm creating this, but it's very real when you're in it. You can feel everything that's going on. It feels just as real as me sitting in this chair now.
Well, thanks for mentioning that, because I think lucid dreaming is the kindergarten of the afterlife.
Yeah, yeah,
That you get to experience that how your consciousness creates what you take to be real. Now, this doesn't preclude consensus realities in the afterlife,
exactly.
but as in our physical life, there's no way to know how one perceives even a collective afterlife as opposed to someone else's experience of that same situation. We say that, or we've heard that in the afterlife you may meet um, relatives of yours,
Hmm.
um, and that they will present to you at the age they were when they passed, or at an age where you would recognize them,
Right.
and that as we get settled in the afterlife, our own self-image reverts to our prime of life.
Hmm.
This is sort of like the blueprint for that lifetime. And but we have how we perceive ourselves, if there are mirrors in the afterlife, how it would look to us in a certain way. Um, I believe that we can present ourselves to others in the afterlife however we choose to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that what's going on is that we are modulating their perception. We're not wearing a different suit, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that may sound strange, but it's what we do right now when we talk to each other, trying to communicate impressions that we feel the other will understand.
Right.
It's the same general idea. So I think that in certain respects, our physical life and the so-called afterlife rest on some of the same principles. It's not all that strange.
Yeah.
The more conscious we are of how we perceive our own environment and lives and experiences now, the easier is our both intellectual and conceptual, and then finally physical transition
Yes.
to the other side.
Yeah.
And of course, some people are in tune with the so-called other side quite often, some full time, and then the other side of the spectrum would be the sort of the rigidly materialistic sense of reality. So it's a spectrum, like so many other things.
Yeah.
And I think what's happening now in our culture at large, I can't speak for other cultures in the world, but all I know is in our culture, there is a shift going on. And you go to Amazon and you search on the word afterlife, and 20,000 results come up.
Yeah, that has definitely been a shift, and it's really interesting to me because in Calling Earth, there's the electronic phenomenon. You mentioned earlier we're a technological society. We like the technology, right? So we're really impressed with the fact that spirit can speak through a tape machine or put images on the screen or put images onto film, stuff like that. That seems to really impress us as opposed to someone saying, "Well, I had an after a visit, a dream visit, or I had a near death experience." Even we seem to place more value in that physical aspect.
Right. Well, that's natural. And I think it's good that we can do that and that we can share we can share the proof, as it were.
Yeah.
That the word proof is another kind of one of my favorite whipping boys, because technically proof is nothing but a consensus.
Yeah.
Proof
Great
is
point.
the evidence.
Yeah.
The evidence may be physical or anecdotal or whatever it is, but when we say something has been proven, that's a social definition.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely is.
So you can't bring proof to a situation. You can bring evidence, and then whatever the consensus there will say either we consider it proof or not. You need more proof now.
Yeah.
Um, so where was I?
Well, I would like to talk about. We talked about we talked about calling Earth. I'd like to talk about also the Scole experiment, which was after you and I connected, we set up this interview. You mentioned that film to me, and so that was relatively new to me. So explain to people what the Scole experiment is and what your documentary covers.
Hey, the Scole experiment was an experiment in what's called physical mediumship. Now, mental mediumship involves connecting with the other side and bringing messages through.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or in some cases, a medium they'll sort of step aside, and someone on the other side will kind of take over their body, and they'll be there, and be present with you. But that's considered mental mediumship. In physical mediumship, physical phenomena occur that can be recorded, preserved, so on, as evidence of the other side, evidence of the other side, evidence of factual paranormal phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
The Scole experiment was undertaken around 1994, 95 in the tiny English village of Scole, Scole. It's about a half hour northeast of Cambridge. And it was undertaken by two couples. One of the couples were accomplished mental mediums. The other couples had been researchers of physical mediumship for many years. And over a period of 5 years, they had 500 sessions sitting around a table in a darkened cellar with just enough illumination from like luminous tabs on the tables and luminous wristbands on their wrists, just so that no hanky-panky could go on.
Mm-hmm.
Over these 500 sessions, they were able to produce an amazing variety of phenomena. including physical objects appearing, bang, on their table.
Right.
Materialization of objects, voices in the room just coming out of the air, not just out of the medium's mouths. Through the mediums, they connected with a team on the other side. And with this team, they worked together to work out experiments to see what they could do. This wasn't all written in stone. It was an ongoing experiment. In one experiment, they were asked to put a conventional film camera on their table, which they did. And in the dark, they heard the camera levitating and floating around the room and the shutter clicking repeatedly. In the start. Camera went back down on the table, and they were asked to develop the film. And this was color film, I believe. But what they found on the film were 11 black and white photographs, which they were told were copies of pictures that existed somewhere in the world. And they were actually able to track down some of these images. Then they were asked to just put the roll of film on their table. And if the spirit team on the other side felt that they had produced something, the experimenters were asked to develop the film, which they did. And what they found on these films was a marvelous variety of writing, images, signatures of known people. There was a complete poem by the British poet William Wordsworth. It was a variation on one of his famous poems, and it was signed W.W. Wordsworth. They had also been doing some experiments with a recorder. And by the way, this experiment was witnessed by hundreds of visitors, including scientists, engineers, a stage magician. Nobody could find any fault with it. For a period of 3 years, or 2 or 3 years, they were monitored. Every session was monitored by a team from the British Society for Psychical Research, which is a skeptical organization.
Right.
And these 3 investigators could find no way in which these phenomena could have been faked. And there are several books published about this. You can see this in the film. And then at a certain point, they were allowed to take this show on the road. They did sessions in several European countries. They did it at a home in Los Angeles. I went and interviewed the participants there 10 years after this happened, and they were still blown away by the experiences they'd had. So you have to see the film, is all I can say. And the film really it's a 90-minute film, and it just scratches the surface of the Scole experiment. One of the most interesting, I think, claims there was by Robin Foy, who was one of the 2 chief experimenters and researchers. And he claimed that his parents physically materialized in the room, that he could embrace them physically. Now, I've heard stories about materializations, and I'm fascinated with it. Have been fascinated with it for a long time, especially since I once met someone who apparently had been dead for 2 years. It was a friend of a friend. This was back when I lived in New York City. Went to visit a friend one evening, and an old friend of his had shown up out of nowhere. This guy was named Joe. He was a big guy. I'm over 6 feet. He was taller than I am, mustache, strong handshake. Great. Glad to meet you, Joe. Then Joe and John went out to dinner. I went back home. After that, Joe disappeared. John couldn't find him. Guy's phone had been disconnected. And in fact, he hadn't seen Joe in years previously, and he had no contact with him. And then Joe just showed up at his door that night. Anyway, not long after that, my friend John is going into Macy's department store. Excuse me. Joe's wife was working there. So he said, "Hi, how you doing? How's Joe?" And the wife said, "I'm sorry, John. Joe died 5 years ago." And John said, "But I just saw him 2 years ago."
Oh, wow.
And his wife said, "No, don't mess with me, John. I was with him when he died. I went to his funeral and so on." So figure that one out.
Wow.
Now, makes me wonder, and I'd heard stories about materialization, but had
Yeah.
you had you told me at the time when I was in the room with Joe, that he had was just visiting from the other side, I would have said that's BS.
Wow.
Like totally physical, totally real. No, couldn't tell. So it makes me wonder, you see people walking along the street. How many of them are just visiting?
Yeah. Wow, that's wild. I hadn't heard a story like that before. Yeah.
So I don't accept everyone's stories about everything.
Right.
I believe in checking things out, but I know what my own experiences have been,
Right.
and that includes some pretty far out stuff. Um, but I think it's only far out from the perspective of our sort of ordinary lives,
Yeah.
and it's no further out than the idea that the Earth is round.
Well, it's interesting
The
you
same as
say that
one's
because
flat.
I like to believe that I'm still a skeptic, even though I believe there's definitely something going on. I have no doubt that there is something going on. But as you said, I don't believe everybody's story. And the nice thing about these two documentaries we're talking about is they're documentaries. They're documented. We can examine the evidence as close as we can with our own eyes. We can see, and in the case of the Scole experiment, you said it's well documented. The skeptics that went there. They had a magician come and say, okay, if I were setting this up, this is what I would do. And so these are people that were subject to scrutiny. And and there's also there's just to me there's so much there, and that's why I refer people to especially the Calling Earth documentary all the time when people will say, I'm like, here, go check this out. Because if people are truly skeptical, we've already touched about this, the difference between a skepticism, scientific method, and a debunker or just a cynic. They're not the same thing. You can be skeptical, but if you're skeptical, you're going to check it out.
Yeah. Well, it's the original etymology of skeptic is one who looks into things.
Yeah, yeah,
And so you don't accept things, at face value. You look into them as best you can, and you make up your own mind. And if there's a collective, if there's a consensus about something, fine, you can work with that. Um, it's difficult in our world for this shift to take place, I think, partly because our world is so complex.
hmm.
People have challenges and problems and on so many levels at the same time. But I think in spite of that, that this shift is underway. And I think it's a healthy thing. I think it helps to take the edge off some of what we take to be our own human problems,
Hmm.
particularly the notion or fear of death, which can be a very powerful influence in a number of ways, including in nefarious ways.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
I think the fear of death is at the core of all the fears that we have. I mean, I think when you really boil it down to all the fears we have, they're basically come down to the fear of death.
I agree.
And the reason why we fear death is because to us it's unknown. I was speaking with someone recently who has a big fear of death, and I said, it's like you're walking towards this door at the end of a hallway, and you're inevitably going to go through that door at some point. If you have no idea what's on the other side of that door, of course you're going to be scared. That's just a natural human response. And I find for myself, the more I find out about what's on the other side of that door, the less I fear it.
Yeah, well, it in a way it should work the other way around. If we don't know what's on the other side of the door, why fear it automatically?
Right.
So either way, you're right that fear, and I think that that's interesting. Can you see my image flickering right now?
It is. Yeah.
That's never happened before.
Is that, yeah, it looks like, yeah, almost like a light's coming on and off. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not. My room lighting is consistent, hasn't been blinking,
Hmm.
but the video image is.
Yeah.
Let me cover the camera for just a moment, and it's continuing.
Yeah. That's pretty wild.
Isn't that wild?
Well, I was recording one of these a couple of weeks ago, and I had a couple of people on. They were both mediums, and as I was talking to one of them, I just saw this orb shoot across the room, and I'm like, okay, it wasn't dust because it wasn't going down; it went up and like to the right, And I was asking the other person, I said, "Did you see that?" And she said, "Yeah." And the medium goes, "This happens to me all the time. People tell me when we're on Zooms, they see orbs." So,
Right. Well, I just did a presentation on orbs to a group that I meet with every Sunday. It's a Zoom group based in Australia
hmm,
called the Global Gathering, and it's currently it's on Sundays currently at 2 p.m. Pacific time,
hmm,
and it's run by Wendy Zamet, who is
yeah,
the
the
one.
Zamets, yeah,
Yeah, you know the Zamets.
yeah,
Um, and so I sort of how interesting that I think that the flickering has stopped now.
it has, yeah,
Um, that's proof of something. I don't
yeah,
know. It could be a hello from certain friends of mine on the other side. Um, anyway, just back to orbs for a moment. So I just did a kind of a slideshow last week on orbs and explaining that there are 3 or 4 discrete classes of orbs, one of which is ones that people see with their naked eye.
hmm,
Then there are those that are only seen by cameras
hmm,
and are legitimately paranormal. Then there are those that are only seen by cameras, which are an artifact of it's mainly how small modern digital cameras
exactly,
are
yeah,
configured. They have extremely wide angle lenses, which means they're in focus almost up to the lens. They have lighting and flash units that are right next to the lens and they're illuminating. You know about the inverse square law. If the light is intended to be illuminating something 10 feet away, if it's an inch away, it's thousands of times as bright.
mm-hmm,
So it turns your cell phone camera or small digital camera essentially into a microscope
hmm,
that can
yeah,
pick up dust particles that are just a fraction of an inch from the lens.
right,
So that's a very common form of what we call orbs. And not only are they mistaken for actual objects, but people project their idea of how distant they are from the camera.
oh, good point, yeah,
You never see these orbs peeking out from behind objects.
hmm,
They're that close to the camera. But because they're different sizes, people will instinctively feel that the smaller ones are more distant from the camera,
hmm, yeah,
10, 15 feet away when they're actually only an inch.
yeah,
There's a lot of confusion about that. And for me, the gold standard is the ones that are visible.
yeah,
And if you saw one on video that the person on the other end confirmed that they could see it visually, well, that's you know
yeah,
that's the real deal.
yeah,
Whether these are images of spirits or whether they're images created by spirits as a form of communication, uh, I can't judge. People
right,
kind of assume that they are the spirits themselves. I'm not sure about that. And again, on one level, it hardly matters because these are things that happen that shouldn't happen. And that's enough, in a sense, for us to get at least a basic message
yeah.
that there's in the theater of life, stuff goes on backstage.
Yeah, I love that. It's the first time I've heard that, but I'm gonna have to remember that when theater life stuff goes on backstage. So we're coming. We've got just a few minutes left. I want to talk about your book because I know you we talked about the films that I want to recommend to people. Definitely go. And I saw at least the last time I saw Calling Earth was available on YouTube. So I appreciate you making it available there.
It's on YouTube and Vimeo.
Okay.
Both films are on YouTube and Vimeo,
Yeah.
as is the I'm a Skeptic video. The latest version is on Vimeo. If you go to my website, dandrasin.com, and go to the films page, all the links are there.
Okay. Cool. Cool. So we'll definitely put that in the show notes. But let's talk about your book. What is your book cover?
The book is called A New Science of the Afterlife: Space, Time, and the Consciousness Code.
Hmm.
It's my first book. I sometimes say I wrote it for wives to put under their skeptical husbands' pillows.
I love that.
Um, and it's an attempt to bring this whole question of the afterlife down to relatively simple, basic terms, to recognize how the longest chapter in the book is about language and how language determines what our sense of reality. We I can't speak for how other languages. I mean, French is my second language, but I'm not fluent enough to understand what happens with French. With English, we say things like somebody, nobody, everybody. And when we do that, don't we reinforce the idea that we're nothing but our bodies?
Hmm. Hmm.
We said someone, everyone, no one. It's a little different feeling there.
Mm-hmm.
Less materialistic, if you will. Let me just, I have notes here. Just the chapters, just briefly. First was called Materialism 101.
Mm.
It shines the light on our sort of unconscious relationship with the physical. It points out that science is a method of inquiry, materialism is an assumption about reality.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm reading off each chapter has a summary. So let me just read some of the chapter summaries, and that'll give you a sense of the scope of the book.
Okay.
Materialism 101. We live in a world dominated by a belief in materialism. Science is a method of inquiry. Materialism is an assumption about reality. Social pressures and militant skepticism tend to inhibit post-materialist thinking and research. A paradigm shift into post-materialism is underway. Chapter 2 is the landscape of afterlife research, near-death experience research, reincarnation research, instrumental transcommunication research and practice, mental mediumship, physical mediumship, out-of-body experience research and practice, and then diverse avenues of research represented by the 29 winning Bigelow Institute essays. I don't know if you're familiar with Bigelow.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They had this contest a few years ago, and people wrote amazing material in response to this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, back to my book. Supportive studies in related phenomena, the abilities of autistic savants.
Oh yeah.
You probably be aware of the telepathy tapes.
Yeah, that I love the fact that that podcast is blowing up the way that it is.
Right. And this is, it's this long denied phenomenon is finally getting the attention that it needs.
Mm-hmm.
Terminal lucidity,
Mm-hmm.
which tends to override our notion that an afflicted brain. Here, see that flashing again?
Going again, yeah.
Wow. Thank you, whoever it is, shining a light on it. Um, Terminal lucidity, where if someone who with an afflicted brain, just before they pass, will have a period of time where they're totally lucid and totally normal.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this goes completely against the notion of the brain being the foundation of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
The shared death experience. This is something that's also been only recently recognized, but it's very common where caregivers, relatives, and so on at a deathbed will have their own experience of either perceiving the person's departure into the afterlife, and in some cases accompanying them into the first stage of the afterlife.
Yeah.
This is one, another don't tell the doctor situation, but it's now beginning to be recognized. Then there, of course, psychedelics, which are now understood, I think much better understood in terms of their function and in what they can illuminate about the nature of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
The placebo effect. Well, there's nothing new there, right? Placebo effect has been understood for years, but science overlooks it as an example of the power of the mind to influence the physical.
Yeah.
Then there's lucid dreaming, which we've mentioned, precognition and presentiment. These have been tested and confirmed in laboratories. Clairvoyance and remote viewing. This has been confirmed by the CIA and the United States military over and over and over again. No question there. Then there's map dowsing. And that's where a psychic can, I'll give you an example, which I mentioned in the book, that a friend of mine was a harpist, was performing at a theater and left her harp in the storeroom overnight. When she came back in the morning, it was gone. So her mother, who fortunately is tuned into this sort of thing, consulted a man who was a map dowser.
Hmm.
This was in Oakland, California. So she sent the information to the map dowser who lived in, I think it was in Ohio. And the map dowser looked at the map of Oakland, and he drew a line around a little 4 square block area. And he said, put up posters offering a reward in that 4 square block area.
Hmm.
So she did, and the harp came right back.
Oh, wow.
So that's an example of map dowsing. It's been used to find minerals and so on. Then what is the consciousness code? That's the subtitle of the book. And the idea is that codes, it's the shortest chapter in the book. Is there time for me to read it?
Sure.
Okay, let me get to it here. Okay, it's chapter 4. What is the consciousness code? It's trendy to call things codes these days. But broadly speaking, a code can be anything whose meaning or very existence is wholly or partly hidden or obscure. This may be deliberate, as with encrypted information, or it may be a natural code, such as a DNA code, the shape of a plant's leaves, or the language of a particular bird species. Some things may be hidden by possessing qualities that our senses are not physically equipped to perceive. Examples include radio waves, ultraviolet light, the air on a clear day, deep seismic rumbles, and ultrasonic dog whistles. Other things in perfectly plain sight may be effectively invisible to us because our culture has no particular interest in them or is motivated to ignore or deny them. These can be difficult or impossible to recognize, and what we can't recognize, we obviously can have no motivation to decode.
Hmm.
Consciousness is an excellent example of a code hiding in plain sight. On the one hand, nothing should be more immediate or obvious than our own consciousness.
Yeah.
On the other, our materialistic culture puts enormous unspoken pressure on us to ignore it or to explain it away as an illusory byproduct of neurological functioning. As a result, our chances of decoding it, laying bare its remarkable nature, properties, and potentials have tended to be slim. So we end up like moviegoers, absorbed in a captivating adventure or love story, while being oblivious to the screen, the projector, and the vast community of talented professionals behind the scenes. They don't exist in our reality unless we happen to be filmmakers or students of filmmaking who know what to look for and why to bother looking in the first place. Perhaps to make better movies? As we have now seen, where honest science has stepped up to the plate and begun to decode and demystify consciousness. Better movies, a richer appreciation of reality, more profound and beautiful experiences, and a healthy and more insightful relationship to life and death appear to be an inevitable result. Coming soon to a realm near you.
Oh, I love it. I love it. That is great. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure. And the book was fun to write. It was a slog, like most writing is, but I feel like I was able to express the basics that I wanted to get across. There are other chapters too, which I won't go into now, but I hope people find it a good primer and a good sort of safe way to get into these.
Yeah, and I loved you covered such a broad body of evidence, and as we've had this conversation, we've talked about words like skeptic and denier, and we talked about words like proof. There is, what you said earlier. I think it's spot on. Proof is only what we come to when we come to a consensus. So then we call it proof. There's really not much that's provable. We can just look at it and say, yeah, we've got enough evidence to say, yeah, this is the way it works. So if someone does have someone in their a loved one who's a skeptic and is open minded, something like this can help them to kind of say, okay, this gives you more evidence. I have a really good friend who was a straight up materialist, atheistic, and came to me and said, I know you believe this stuff. Tell me why. And so I gave her. She went to a medium actually, and the medium blew her away. And she came back. She said, "Give me more." So I gave her, some books by Bruce Grayson and I think Penny Satori and Bernardo Kastrup and some other different people. And she came back. She goes, "Wow, she's convinced now. She's totally convinced." So your book is going to add to that body that we can hand to somebody and say, or if you're listening to this right now, and you're like, "I'm not quite convinced," but if you're open, there's a lot of evidence out there, and I appreciate you sharing that and making it so accessible to people.
Well, thanks. It's been a joy and a privilege to be doing this work. I should also mention that for about the past 5, 6 years, I've been working with a particular team of mediums.
Oh, okay.
Quite amazing. They're best known for having channeled the astronauts, the crews of the NASA space shuttles Challenger and Columbia.
Hmm.
And their work is quite spectacular. We have created a website called cosmicvoices.network.
Okay.
It's not .net, it's .net. Cosmic Voices, one word,
Mm-hmm.
.network.
Okay.
And it's partly a repository of channeling that these two mediums have done over the years. One of them lives in Los Angeles, and she was told when she was a child, "You're going to be a medium to the stars."
Hmm.
And Jean says, "What she didn't tell me was they'd all be dead." And so the people who are she herself is a trained singer,
Hmm.
so she relates to the arts community, and she is evidently known on the other side in that community. And when someone in that professional sphere passes over, um, they sometimes will show up. I mean, Jean and Regina, the other medium, and I often have Zoom meetings,
Hmm.
and sometimes these folks will show up in the middle of a Zoom meeting
Oh,
for
wow.
one or the other of the mediums. Um, one of them is, believe it or not, Robin Williams,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
who has chosen to stick close to the earth plane, as he puts it, because he feels that he can be helpful in healing people when they pass over. It's healthy for people to know that we don't die, and and he feels that humor is such a healing and important aspect of our lives, and and he tries to keep that alive as best he can from where he is.
Wow.
Like we can be having a conversation on Zoom, and all of a sudden he'll come in and he'll have us in stitches.
Hmm. Wow.
So it's a wonderful experience. Um, there's a joke that so many people want to come through these mediums that they're having to give out numbered tickets on the other side.
Hmm.
And last year we were having our Zoom meeting, and do you remember Liberace?
Yes.
He was this flamboyant, very
Hmm.
wonderful pianist, has flamboyant style. So he comes through, and he's talking to us. He says, I lived a series of very kind of dour and repressed lifetimes.
Oh.
I told myself this time I'm going to cut loose and have fun.
Oh, wow.
And you have to read his exact words. It's on our website. But that was a wonderful experience. And he said, I finally got my ticket in. So his another one that I was really moved by was Neil Armstrong. And he was the first man to walk on the moon.
Hmm.
And he died in a strange way. He was hospitalized, and I don't remember whether it was a medical error or a part of a condition that they didn't catch, but he died in the hospital
Hmm.
with his family around him, including his deceased daughter who appeared to him.
Hmm. Oh,
And
wow.
it's an extremely touching account of his experience of being helped over to the other side by
Oh,
his.
wow. Wow.
So, whether you accept these communications as real or not, they're wonderful reads.
Yeah. Sounds
We actually
awesome.
we have
Well, I've to include that in the show notes. Yeah.
on the messages page. There's two columns. One is names you'd recognize, and the others are names that you would not recognize.
Hmm.
These include the New York Fire Department captain who was the captain at 9/11,
Okay.
and that's an amazing story. And there
Wow.
are one a woman who was the first American civil engineer who was involved in the creation of the Hoover Dam. Um, anyway, just check it out,
Yeah.
and it's a good read. Again, whether you believe any of it or not, I think it's fascinating and informative.
Absolutely. Well, you're a wealth of information. Thank you for sharing that. So, it was great to meet you today. Great to have you here. As I said, I've been a fan of your work for quite a while. So I'm glad we were able to sit down and do this, and happy to help people discover the book as well. But check out the films. They're on YouTube and Vimeo. And Daniel, have a great rest of your afternoon.
You too, Brian. Thanks. It's great to meet you. I wish we could shake hands, but
Yeah.
okay. Take care, and hopefully we'll be in touch.
Yeah. Have a good afternoon.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.